welcome. So hi, I'm Mike.
Hi, Mike.
I'm a Drupal developer. It's been 3 months since I used features. And hopefully today,
Hello, Mike.
hopefully today I'll convince you to break the habit as well. So I'm currently one of the maintainers of the features module, wrote the D8 version, did the D7 7.2 version, also the architect of the Open Atrium 2 distribution. And what I want to talk about today is a lot of things, and I mark this as an intermediate class, and so I'm going to do the beginning parts fairly quickly, so I'm hoping that people mostly know about config in D8, but I'm going to run through it really quick anyway. And then try to get to some advanced stuff, because what I want to really cover is the hard stuff that we have to deal with day to day, and why config management is still such a pain, even though it's still one of the greatest things in D8, and why we still struggle, and what some of the new solutions are. Who here was here at my talk last year on configuration best practices? Anybody? Okay, so sorry, I'm going to change the answer because as the years go on, things change. We get new modules, we get new ways of doing things, and that's what I want to talk about today. Anyone here read my blog last week on Stop Using Features? Okay, a couple people, good. And that's going to be part of it too. So let's get into it. So quickly reviewing config management for people that are just starting out here. So you've got this big Drupal database, your big MySQL database, and there's all this stuff in it, right? Your pages and your articles and your comments and your users, and we call that content, right? That's the stuff that your users are putting on your site. And then there's all these other things in the same database. There's your content types, your fields, your views, all the miscellaneous site information, checkboxes, all the stuff that you do in the admin interface to customize your site. And we call that config. And the problem is those are both in the same database. And yet the dilemma is that your configuration is coming from your developers. It's your developers working on your content types and your fields and your views, but your content comes from your production users. They're the ones on the actual production site creating articles and blogs, commenting and so forth. And so how do you take those two pieces of the database and merge them together? You know, how do you pull the config from the developers and the content from the users and keep doing that over and over as you update your site? So in D7, the way we all did this was with features. And we took the config and used the feature module to export that config into code. And then we had these feature modules. They were just part of your code base. You would deploy them just like the rest of your code using Git. And everything was mostly okay. I mean, it was D7, so it had all of its problems. But it was kind of the only thing we had around, right? So the new D8 way that's built into core is you use something called config export to export the config. And this time, instead of going into module code, they get stored in something called your config sync directory. And they get stored as a bunch of YAML files. And YAML is just a data format. We'll see some examples later. So unlike features, which in D7 made PHP code, which was always kind of weird, like you're storing data, but you're storing it as code, and it's all arrays. Here you're actually storing it as a proper data format. And it's all in this directory called the config sync directory, which you can kind of put anywhere you want. So let's look at how you're supposed to do core D8 deployment of configuration. So you start with your dev environment, and you run one of these config exports, and that dumps all of those YAML files into your config sync directory. And now you're going to go to your staging and QA server, and you're going to do a config import, and that's going to load everything that's in the config sync directory into the database and overwrite anything that's there. So it's going to essentially fill in that top piece of config, but it's going to leave your content alone. So it merges those two databases. And now you do all your QA testing, you make sure it works, you tweak your config however you need it. You now re-export that updated config that's now working, goes to the same config sync directory, and now you go over to your production environment with all your production content, you import the config, and now again you've pulled in that top layer, you now have the working config with your production content, and life is good, right? So the way you do this technically is, first of all, you can specify where you want your config sync directory to go. by default in D8, it's going to store it in your files directory because the files directory is really the only place that's writable typically on your system. But for most of us, we want to manage our config the way we manage our code. We want to get it into our Git repo. So we're typically going to change the sync directory to someplace else other than the files directory that has write permission for the devs that we can put in our Git repo. So for example, you might put it in a top level config/default. And we'll talk about why default a little later. So now you add that directory to your Git repo. So you do a git add config/default. And then on your dev environment, you do your drush config export. So here I'm going to be talking about using drush. Hopefully all you guys for intermediate are used to using drush. There's a limited amount of stuff you can do with config in D8 using the UI, using the config sync UI. The problem is it's a lot of like downloading the tarball and uploading tarballs and moving the stuff around that we don't want to have to deal with. So just use drush. You could also use console if you wanted. But drush has a config export command. So that's going to take everything that's in that config part of the database. It's going to write it out to that config default directory. You've added it to Git. So now you do a git diff, git status, check to see what you're about to commit, just like any other code. Be really careful on this step. It's really super important in D8 to do this step. We've always wanted people to do this step, but now it's really important. You don't want to push config that's bad. You don't want to push stuff that's left over from some of your testing. So review what's about to be added, and then go ahead and commit it, push it to your develop branch. And now over on your QA server, you do a drush config import. You're first going to do a git pull, review what came in, do a drush config import, and now you're good. So this all sounds great and easy, and we've been talking about this now for years, right? This is one of the great things in D8. So why are we still talking about this after all these years? I mean, we're on 8.3 now, going to 8.4, and I don't know about you, but config is still something that our guys spend a lot of time dealing with, and it shouldn't be that way. So what are some of the headaches? Why doesn't the base config system kind of work as smoothly as we would like? Well, the first thing to realize is you can only actually import configuration using drush config import if you have the same site ID. So in Drupal 8, every site has a unique identifier, and it's actually stored in config, which is an interesting catch-22. And when you initially install Drupal for the very first time, it's going to create a new random site ID for you, and it's going to store it in config. And so if you spin up a D8 site and you export your config, and I spin up a D8 site, and I try to take your config and import it, it gives me an error that says, your site ID doesn't match, I can't do that. So what's really important is the biggest transition, the kind of aha moment that I like people to have with D8 is, in D8, your configuration is owned by the site. In D7, with features, the configuration was owned by the modules. Like you created a feature module, that module owned it. If you reverted your features, any new config in that module would take effect, right? And it would overwrite any customizations you made. Like how many of us have feature reverted and lost stuff, right? Because we didn't realize, the super client had gone and changed something in a view somewhere. So the idea in D8 was to make sure that didn't happen anymore. So instead of having modules own their config, the site owns the config, and it's trying to do a lot of checking to make sure that you don't lose stuff. So it checks these things like UIDs to make sure that you're not like accidentally going to overwrite your site with somebody else's site that might be different. But it gets even more complicated than that because each individual config item, every field, every content type, every piece of config has their own unique identifier. And that is created randomly when you initially create the config. So if you create a new content type and add a field to it, that new field gets a unique identifier. So now the problem is, what if you've got two developers on a project and they're working on like the same ticket, which they shouldn't be, and one of them creates a field for testing and exports it, and now I create a field for testing and I try to import the other developer's stuff, it's going to get conflicting UIDs and it's not going to import the config. So it's not even just the site ID, it's the individual configuration ID that can sometimes be a problem. The other thing that can mess you up sometimes in D8 is that config import command that I showed you with drush. It will tell you what it's about to do. Like it will say, hey, there's all this new config that's being created. So guys, you can't sit on the floor. You have to find a seat because the fire marshal is on site. So sorry. Is there any way we can make room for somebody up front here? And
Here.
okay, great. Thank you so much for moving. Yeah, thanks. So when you do a config import, it will tell you what it's about to do. So it might be creating new config, it might be updating existing config, or it might be deleting config. You know, if you actually delete one of those YAML files in your config sync directory and do an import, it's going to delete that config in your database. And that might be config that you wanted. So you have to be really careful and look at config import and what it's going to do. And even the standard profile will do this sometimes. If you do a standard Drupal install and try to do a config import, it's going to complain that there's some shortcuts that got created that it's about to delete. So some useful day-to-day drush commands. We talked about this command a little bit. Here's more on it. So this drush config export. If you do a help on this, you'll see a lot of options. Honestly, a lot of those options are for doing Git things. So they kind of like merge some Git commands with the config export command. So it will automatically add stuff. It will automatically commit. It will even automatically push. I tend to not use those. I prefer just to use the Git that I know and love so that I don't do something wrong. But use them if you'd like. There's also this optional label. So by default, it's going to use your config sync directory that we configured earlier. And if you go back and look, you'll notice that when we set it in our settings.php, we gave it the key sync. Sync is the default name that it's going to use when you export. But you can actually create multiple export locations and name them whatever you want. And when you do a config export, you can say, hey, config export over here, and give it a different directory name, and it will do that. So all of the config commands kind of have that label. And then config import has the same label. The other useful option for config import is if you want to see what's going to be changed at a more detailed level, you can say -- preview equals diff, and it will actually show you, hey, in your site settings, you're going to change the title of the site or something like that, right? It's going to give you those details. And then there's this partial option that we will talk about. So what is the partial option, and what does it do, and why should you be careful? So first of all, to even make partial work properly at all, make sure you have Drush 8.1.0 or greater. What partial is trying to do is get around this issue of deleting config. You probably don't want to accidentally delete stuff you're working on. Like maybe you're working on two tickets. You're working on the blog ticket and the article ticket. So you've already created the blog content type. And now the PM says, hey, we need to do this hotfix. And so you try to switch over to the master branch, pull it in to do a hotfix, you do a config import. Well, it doesn't have the blog yet, right? Config import's going to delete your blog, but you're in the middle of working on it, you maybe haven't stashed it yet, and so you don't want to necessarily overwrite the stuff that you've got on your database. So the -- partial option will kind of do a merge without deleting. And so some people like this for convenience because they don't want to lose the stuff they're in the middle of, and they don't want to take the trouble of making a database backup and restoring a clean prod database. But the problem with this is, as soon as you do a config import partial, you now have what I call dirty config. You've got the production config plus some random config that you're messing with in develop, okay? And it's really easy to accidentally export that and get your dev stuff stored in production or in your repo. So certainly don't get in the habit. If you're in the habit, break it. Don't use git add -a. Don't do git commit -a. Review your changes before you do a push. So if you do a config export, take a look at what's about to be pushed and make sure you don't have like that dirty blog that you're in the middle of working on that isn't ready yet. You can undo that at that point. But the best way to really do this is if you're going to do hot fixes, stash your changes, back up your database, restore a clean prod database, do your hotfix there, config export, then go back to your branch that you're working on, restore your dev database. So it's not that hard to save and restore databases these days. It doesn't take long. And try to avoid the -- partial. It's there, but I don't think we need to use it anymore. So some other useful Drush commands. So if you want to mess around with low-level config and actually see where something is, like maybe you don't want to navigate to the UI to look at some settings, you can do a config get and give it the name of your config ID, and it will actually show you what's in the database. Now we're going to talk about overrides in a little bit, Overrides are things like in your settings.php that we'll go into more detail on. You can use -- include overrides to actually show the overridden value. So maybe it's not the actual site name in the database, but it's the overridden site name. So config get can be useful for inspecting the database. And then, of course, there's a config set option to let you just quickly set an option. And we'll see an example where that's useful a little bit later. And even better, there's a config edit option that will bring up that whole config YAML file in your local editor. So maybe you don't want to go off and find it in the config sync directory and you just want to edit it live. Maybe you haven't even exported it yet. Config edit will load the config out of the database, create that YAML file, let you edit it, and any changes you make will get written back to the database. Again, it's great for developers. Definitely don't do that on production, but useful tools. So a couple other commands. Maybe you don't even know what the config ID of something is, so you can use config list. So like if you do drush config list field, it will show you all your fields and field storages. So anything that starts with a given prefix value, it will display for you. And then if you really need to, you can delete config with config delete. Be really careful with this. It will actually let you delete sometimes config that has content associated with it. It's really actually kind of a weird command. If you delete a field storage, it actually won't give you an error, but it won't do anything if you have content because it knows that you don't want to delete the field storage. But if you tell it to delete a field instance on a content type, it'll go ahead and do that even if you have content in there. So just be careful. Useful again for development purposes, but not for day-to-day. So let's get into, so that was a quick review. Hopefully all that stuff was stuff you mostly knew about. So now let's talk about some more complicated stuff. So how do you actually spin up a site? Like you've taken all of this time to build a site, create content types, create fields, it's all working the way you want. Wouldn't it be nice to just kind of clone that site and yet not clone the content, right? I don't want all of my test content and production content. Maybe I need to spin up 100 sites. I know a lot of you do that, right? You've got to spin up a bunch of multi-site stuff. And you want them all to have the same content types and the same fields and the same views and all the same configuration. So wouldn't it be nice if you could install a site using your config? And it turns out you can, and this is something that's actually changed pretty recently. So what's involved in kind of spinning up a site? Now I like to start with a profile. And in D8, a profile doesn't actually really have much in it because you're probably going to use something like Composer to list, here's all my modules and what versions they are, and you're going to use Composer to actually build the site. So profiles don't necessarily have a lot in them, but it's going to be useful, as you'll see in a minute, to start with one. So one dev, like your main tech lead, they're going to start doing the initial install of your profile for the very first time. And they're just going to use drush, site install, whatever your profile name is. And your profile can just be a .info file. It doesn't have to have any modules or anything else. It's just something that lives in your profiles directory. So drush will go ahead and install that site. And of course, it's going to give it a unique site ID at that point. That's going to now become the canonical site ID for all of your other instances of that site. Because this is the first install. It's the first time you started from scratch. So now go ahead and make sure that in your settings.php, you've got your config sync directory set. So back to that earlier step where we put it in config/default. Go ahead and do that now. Put that in your settings.php. Confirm that the install profile is correct. That should have happened during install, but just double check that it has your profile name. Once those two things are set, now you can go ahead and do your initial clean export. So you haven't created anything yet. You don't have any content types or fields or views. You just got a clean install of your profile, do your initial config export, and then add that to your repo for your code, and now you've got the clean site. Okay? Go ahead and commit it and push it to your repo. So now, what do we do with this? How can we create our second site using this code repo? So now this code repo has Drupal core, and it has your initial config sync directory, and it has whatever modules you've installed, through your Composer process. So what your second developer is going to do is going to install this site using your config, and there's 3 ways to do this. And I'm going to give you a newish way that I think works the best. I'm going to talk about 2 older ways that you might already be using. So what I think is the current best way is to use a patch. And I've got the core patch down there at the bottom. This patch is working its way through core. It might make 8.4, but time's getting short, so we'll see. But it's there. It's being worked on by core people and config management core people, like you'll recognize the names. It's a pretty simple patch. What this patch does is allow you to put your config sync directory into the profile. So you still use the same drush site install profile name that you used before, but in your profile's info.yaml file, you add this line called config install, and you tell it the path to your config sync directory. Okay, so here we've put in config/sync, and in my previous example it was supposed to be config/default, so wherever you put it, right? Config/default, config/sync. Now, one interesting trick here, if you want, is if you put your config into the actual profile directory, like under profile name, where normally your custom modules would go, if you actually create a directory in your profile called config sync, it will load that automatically. So you know how you normally put your initial config like in the config install directory, so instead of config install, you put it all in config sync, and it will actually load from there automatically without even using the config install key. So the config install key is an override for that default. So what this will do is when you do the site install, it does a little bit of magic. It actually checks the sync directory first to see what the site ID is, and instead of setting the site ID randomly, it sets the site ID using the exported config. So now you have the same site ID that your previous site had.
So the intent on this would be that instead of having to copy a site over verbatim, you could just install it through the sync directory.
Exactly. So you're installing a clean site. You're not copying the site over, because if you copy a site over, you're going to get all its content too. So here you want to create a new clean site that has all your config without your content. So it's going to set the site ID, and then it's going to actually do the config import. So the catch-22 with config import, like if you're just using drush commands, right? You do a drush site install. Well, the drush site install sets a random site UID. And now you try to do a drush config import, and it says, I'm not going to do that because your site ID doesn't match. So this little patch just kind of reverses thing. It sets the site ID first, and then it does the config import. But it does that in core now, using the install. So you don't even have to use drush site install with this core patch. You could actually go into the UI and do a normal interactive install. You'll see your profile listed as one of the available profiles, and when you install that profile, it will automatically do a config import. So really useful patch. So another one that people have been using before this patch, because the patch is relatively new, I'd say it's been around for a few months now. Previously, there was this new option added to drush site install called config. And so you could do a drush site install, your profile name, and then config and give it the name of your, the path to your config sync directory. So config/default. And there's the meta issue that talks about kind of all things related to installing stuff from config. So this kind of worked, but again, because it was a drush command, it had some issues. So it did set your site ID correctly. So it had that correct problem, or that correct solution. But the problem is, what if your profile actually has its own config that it creates at install time? Like, let's say your profile dynamically creates a field, okay? In the previous case, your site IDs are all set before you create that field. And so everything is good. Here, it's going to actually create the field during install time, and then drush, even though the site ID is the same, now drush is going to sync the config. That config has a different UUID for the field storage and things like that. And so what it can do is it can end up telling you later that there's a potential schema change. So it gets confused sometimes. It thinks that maybe the field storage is different between the two because it saw a change in the UUID. So it doesn't prevent you from installing. You don't get any install error. You don't get any non-mismatched site UID or UUIDs. It typically happens after you run cron. After you run cron, if you go to your Drupal status page, it will say you have some uncommitted config changes or schema changes, and you have to answer yes to that. The trouble is, it happens every time you do a fresh install. So every time you do this command, like I'm going to install a fresh site today, I do this command, I run cron, Now I have to say yes to all these entity changes again. You'll see this right now in Lightning, and there's a Lightning issue that I've listed there for you. But it actually also happens if you just install the standard profile in Drupal. If you use this command to install standard, then run cron, you'll see some entity changes because, of course, standard installs things like page and article during the install process. So it kind of works, and I think people have been using it. They might not be aware of these issues. They maybe see the entity changes and go, I'm not sure what caused this, but I'll just hit yes and hope everything's okay. So it's just a little bit rocky. So still usable, but I prefer the core patch previously. And then, so what about config installer? This was talked about a lot a year or so ago. Alex Pott did this to try to kind of start this whole process of how do you install config, or how do you install site using config. So he wrote this profile called config installer. And when you have this project installed, this profile installed, when you select it from your installer, it prompts you to either upload a tarball or to give the location of your config sync directory and tries to install from that. It's getting old now. It hasn't been updated since February. I can't get it to work with Lightning, for example. And it's kind of weird because it's a profile itself, and you're installing a profile with that profile, and it has to do some magic to like get rid of config installer when it's done. And so it's a little rough around the edges. And like I say, I think it's just maybe not being maintained in favor of this core patch that's trying to get this all into core. So if you're still using config installer, you might want to take a look at these other this other patch to see if that's a better method for you. Okay, so great. That lets you spin up lots of sites based on your profile. They all have the same config, they all have the same IDs, everything's great, and this is what we do to spin up sites. It works really, really well. So what if you do have to set the site ID manually? I just wanted to throw this in, especially for people with existing sites. It isn't actually that hard to do if you need to. You basically go look in your system.site config, and you'll see this thing at the top that says UID, and there's your site name, and there's your site admin email, and everything else that's in your system configuration. So you can go ahead and you can copy that UID to your clipboard, and now you can use the drush config set command to set the system site UUID and paste in the UUID. And it will actually then prompt you if you want to update your UUID, and you say yes. So that's the method if you need to set the site ID manually for some other reason because you've got two messed up sites. How about updates? How do updates work with config profiles? So let's say you're updating config. Maybe that config changes some schema. And so now you've got some update hooks to fix the schema or update some content. You've changed a field, and so you wrote an update hook like you should. So what order do you run update versus config import? So this is the order that you run things. You pull your code, do a composer install, because maybe part of that pull updated one of your module versions, and so you want to get the latest version of your modules. This assumes that you've got your composer lock file also as part of your repos, so that everybody's all on the same page in terms of versions. So now your modules are all up to date. Now you run update hooks, because now you've got the updated module that has the update hooks in it. So you run update hooks first. Now update hooks have done whatever it needs to do to make everything work so that when you do config import, you don't have any schema changes. So that's the correct order. Do not do an import before running update hooks. You'll run into problems. And in fact, this is about to be enforced in core. So there's another core patch that probably is going to make it to 8.4. And if you try to do a config import when there are pending updates, it will refuse to run. So it will force you to run update hooks first. So then the next complexity that people run into all the time when you're building complicated sites is, the site owns the config. That's great, that's hunky-dory, wonderful. But config isn't the same on my sites. You've got your production environment with like your Google Analytics API keys. And you don't want to use those API keys on your dev environment because then you're going to pollute the client's Google Analytics page with all your dev stuff. Or you're on production on Acquia, and Acquia's got Acquia connector installed so that it can talk to the Acquia stuff. You don't have that on your dev site. So you've got different config, and yet Drupal 8 is designed to make the config identical across all your sites. And it doesn't work out so well. And this is one of the areas where people were still kind of messing with features and stuff. So what's the solution now for this? So you've got your different environments like local, stage, prod, QA, however many environments you have. There's a new module, or a newish module, called config split. It's getting a lot of attention and a lot of use. I like it a lot. Go take a look at it. What it does is it lets you split configuration into different directories. And then when you do the config import command, it will merge those directories together to do the import. So it has a nice UI. You basically go into the UI and you create, let's see, is my next slide talk about this? Yep, so you go into config splits UI, and there's a blog post here that's got a good description of this actual workflow. You basically create a sync directory for each of your environments. So you create one for prod, and one for dev, and one for QA. And then in the UI, you tell it, first disable all of these, okay? And this is the important step. Make sure you're in the UI, you disable each one of these splits. And then you export the full configuration. So what you're exporting is no splits, okay? It's just, you've still got your config sync directory with 90% of your config, and then you've got little bits of config in these individual split directories, but you've disabled those by default. So then in your settings.php, you enable the split that you want for that environment. So typically there's some way to tell which environment you're on. Like there's an environment variable or some directory you can look at. On Acquia, there's an environment variable that says, prod or dev. So you can use that to tell it which split to enable. So by default, they're all disabled, but now in your settings.php, you're overriding that with, here's the one that's enabled. Now when you do the config import, it's going to import your normal config default directory, but then it's also going to import whichever split environment you've turned on. So if you're on dev, it's going to take config default with your dev. If you're on prod, it's going to take config default with your prod. Okay? If you actually want to update, so config export is normally going to only update your main, your default. If you need to update like the prod or the dev, there's this new Drush command called config split export that you use to update the actual split. So let's look at how this actually would work in practice. So here's our three environments that we're going to talk about: dev, stage, and prod. So we do this initial config import on dev. Like we've pulled the latest repo, we want to get all the latest changes. So we do our config import on dev. That's going to take the config from the default directory along with our local split, our dev split. So here I've called it local. And it's going to merge those two together and do a config import. So now you do some work, and you add some fields or whatever your dev task is, and now you do a config export. Config export will only update the config that's in the default directory. It's not going to update any of the local specific stuff. If you need to do that, you use the config split export, and it will update that. So now you go to your stage, and you do a config import. Well, now this time it's going to take your main default config and it's going to merge it with whatever's in the stage directory. And that's going to bring that into your stage. And now you do a config export from here. It only updates the master default. And then on production, you do an import and it pulls the default along with the prod. Okay? So this is basically how your config flows from left to right. And each individual environment has its own split configuration. The nice thing about this is you can basically put anything in the splits that you want. You can give it individual, like, hey, I just want my site settings to be split, or I just want my Google Analytics to be split, or I just want the Acquia configuration to be split. The other nice thing it has is it has a list of modules you basically want blocked. So this is an important concept with config split. By default, every module that you're normally enabled is going to be enabled. When you tell it what split to use, it will then look at the blacklist for that split, and it will turn off any modules in the blacklist. So for example, on dev, you would blacklist Acquia Connector, Google API, or Google Analytics, right? Anything that's dev specific. It does this kind of after the fact, and this is kind of a trick because the list of what modules is enabled on your site is in config. There's this core.extensions YAML file in your config sync directory that tells you what modules to enable. So when you do that config import, it imports core.extensions and it tries to turn on all these modules. But config split kind of comes in after the fact before it happens and says, oh, but wait, blacklist these. So those modules don't actually get enabled on your system. And that's its main trick that it's doing that you can't really do otherwise. You can't really do that with Drush very easily. We used to have this thing with Drush where you could kind of ignore certain modules when you did config export. If you're on Acquia, their older version of BLT tools, in your project.json file, you could actually specify like enable and disable these modules on these environments. So everybody was kind of trying to patch around this. Now config split is doing that for you. And is a cleaner way. So in fact, the new Acquia BLT tools use config split, and they're deprecating that list of module enable and disable. So for example, on prod, block devel. And now devel is not going to get turned on in prod. So it's the kind of thing we used to do in D7 a lot, even with features, right? We had all these features, and we wanted to enable some on production, but not on dev, and vice versa, and that was hard. Config split helps solve that in D8. So the next thing that you sometimes run into is, well, what happens if I want to override config? I have config split, which is great, and that gives me environment-specific stuff. But I really want the client to be able to change the site title, and the site title, unfortunately, is in the same file as the site UUID, which is really kind of crazy that they put something that's almost content-like. The admin email address and the site title are in the same file as the site UID, which is this major piece of config. But anyway, that's the way Drupal is. But sometimes you need to override these things, right? So how do overrides work? And let's see, how are we doing here? Oh, God. No, my talks always go way too long, don't they? Okay, we're going to rest through this because I want to get to some cool stuff. So 2 ways of overriding. Overrides depend upon how different modules are getting config. There's 2 different ways to load config in D8. You can call config, and this is giving you read-only config. This is config that can be overridden. So if I override my system.site in settings.php, I'm going to get the overridden value. However, modules can also call this to get config. You can call the config factory get editable. This gives you read-write config, for example, using in your edit forms. This config ignores any overrides. So if you run this on system.site, but your settings.php changes your site name, you don't get the overridden name, you get the name stored in the normal form. So this is why if you override like your site name, but you go to the UI and look to see what it says, it won't show your overridden site name in that. It shows the site name without the override. And if you edit it, it will take your edits and save it and completely ignore you because it's being overridden. So just be aware that you kind of don't even know if your overrides are going to apply because it depends upon how the module is getting the config. So there is a way to do overrides like this. As I said, you can go into settings.php and override config. There's also a config override module that supports this. It uses the same system that the translation system uses to override config for different languages. So be aware of those if you want to do overrides, but it only affects the immutable read-only config. And of course, that's to say, the UX challenge is your users might expect to see the overrides in your UI, and they don't, and so they wonder, hey, my Google API key is not set, and that's because you're overriding it in settings.php. So I started talking about features. What about features? Why don't we use that anymore? So features was designed, and I told you last year, its purpose was to package configuration into modules. And we used it so we could reuse functionality across sites, and we could organize config, and of course in D7 it was the only way. But we all know features has problems, and if you're like me, you kind of banged your head. And I'm the maintainer of features. I can go fix this stuff in theory, right? Like, why am I banging my head against it? Well, it turns out features just uses core CM, core configuration management. So features can't actually really change how core configuration management works. We can work around some things, but it makes it really hard. So, it's hard to figure out what to put in what feature, and there's these new assignment plugins that try to help, but they're really complicated and people don't even really understand how they work. So you mess with that. You have these unmet dependency errors where you try to do the right thing, and you've got, entity reference field that references a field that's in another content type, and you think it's a circular dependency, and you don't know where to put what, and you try to install the site, and it just gives you unmet dependency errors, and so you mess with that. When you import a feature or revert a feature, if that config didn't exist yet, you get a new config UUID. And so then you try to use, everyone says, oh, use configuration management. So you do the config export, and now you've exported that UUID. Your other developer does a revert. They get a different UUID. And now when you do a config import, you get errors. So features actually doesn't play very well with the normal configuration workflow. And features aren't actually reusable, which we'll talk about in a minute. So stop using features, especially for deployment. And I kind of said this last year, but I guess the message wasn't strong enough, because when I look at the growth of features has gone from 3% of D8 sites to 7% of D8 sites. So it's getting worse, not better. So, you know, Drupal 8 configuration kind of mostly works. It puts configuration in YAML files, does version control, captures all the config. You don't have to worry about what goes where. It's just all in one big directory. Has this clean import and export workflow that we talked about. Showed you some of the ways to get around environment-specific config with config split. So that problem is basically solved now. And you know, do you really care that it's organized into modules instead of in one giant directory? Like, you know, if you go into the giant directory, the file names are actually pretty good. You can find your fields. And it's actually kind of nice to know where your config is, right? And D7 was like, okay, I got to go change this config. Well, what module did I put that in? You know, which feature is that in? Here it's just all in one place. But here's the kicker for some of you. What about distributions? So first of all, what is a distribution in this terminology? What I consider a distribution is kind of a reusable profile. So I said you can use profiles and you can install, you know, 100 different Drupal sites, but those are supposed to be kind of identical sites, you know, within your organization. What if you're trying to build a generic profile, like say OpenAtrium, that's intended to be used by lots of people on lots of different sites? That's a distribution, not just a profile. Distributions are used on lots of different sites, and they have functionality that you're expected to be able to enable and disable. You know, maybe this site doesn't need the news, you know, the press release feature, but this site does. Maybe this one needs a blog and this one doesn't. Like, you have these pieces of functionality that you're expecting your sites to be able to turn on and off. And we've used features for that in the past. The other important distinction with a distribution is a distribution tends to not just be a starting point, but it's something you expect to update over time. That if you improve your blog feature, and you've got 1,000 sites using your distribution, you release a new version of the distribution and you have some update process that allows people to get the new version of that blog. And that's, again, something you don't typically do with just a profile. So how do you do that now? You can't just use what I said before with that core patch and add the config sync directory to your profile, because that config sync directory has all of your UUIDs in it. So if I created OpenAtrium and I provided a config sync directory that had the events and tasks and everything else in it, when you install that on your site, you would get the exact same UUIDs as somebody else installing Atrium on their site. And UUIDs are probably there for a reason, and they're called unique for a reason. We probably don't want 1,000 sites with the same UUIDs. There's probably security implications and all sorts of stuff. So what you really want to do is take that functionality and put it in modules and go into the config install directory and remove the UUIDs so that when Drupal initially installs your site, you'll get unique IDs. But isn't that just what features does? And so why not use features? So the problem is features were supposed to be reusable, and I'm going to have to wrap up, so I'm going to go through this stuff pretty fast. Because this could be a whole talk on itself. This is what I'm working on today. Features were supposed to be reusable, but they're not. Because if you look at configuration, like this is a typical field, in your field's YAML file, you'll see a bunch of project-specific stuff, which is all your machine names. So if you've got, you know, project blog and project image and all of your nicely namespaced stuff, it's all kind of hard-coded there in your YAML files. So every site's going to have the same content type, machine names, and field names. And oftentimes you want those to be different. Like if Berkeley installs OpenAtrium, they want Berkeley blog. And if Stanford installs it, they want Stanford blog. And we can't do that right. So how do we make this reusable? Well, what if we converted those field names into variables, or those machine names into variables? So here I've put @ around variable names, and we're calling this a template. So this is a field template where you can pass it the field name and the bundle name, and it will create a field for you. So now create a way to use that template. So if you're used to using Sass or something, this will be kind of familiar to you, where you can say, or Twig, where you can say include this Twig file with this data. Here you're saying use this template with this data and store it to this configuration ID. So you can also override stuff at the same time. So you can say take that field, store it as project blog and project image, And while you're at it, change the label, change the help text, and make the field required. So these are kind of adding overrides. And this is what the config actions module does. So this is a new module that I'm working on. It's starting to get some use in phase 2. I would love people to start beating the tires and playing with this. It already has a beta release. It basically is a framework for manipulating config. So you create an action file that says, create this config, change this, add this, delete this. It's almost like a script for your config. Imagine using this for update hooks, where you say, hey, go to this config, update the title or help text of my field to this. It's only going to make that one change. It's not going to import the entire config again and overwrite potentially something else that's changed. Imagine that you have a view and you just need to add one thing to the view. So we're done. Go take a look at config actions and config templates, which is the one that goes on top of that. I know. So to summarize really quick, so stop using features, do config import and config export, stop using partial, use the core patch for installing configs from profiles, use Git, use config split. Yes. Yep, the slides are actually already uploaded, and there'll be a video, and use config actions. All right, thanks very much. If you do have questions, since we're gonna have another speaker here, come to the phase 2 booth, and I'll be there for the next hour.